Hey everybody, welcome to Module 6. We're moving pretty quickly now, so this week I just want to go over what we're doing in terms of our assignments. I also want to let you know that before hopefully the end of the week I will post another lecture, maybe one, maybe two, on an overview of our final project to hopefully help you guys out with any questions as you begin to research um, the final steps for this paper. Um, but just remember that the final project is actually it's a buildup of each of our milestones. So you're going to be using a lot of the same information from milestones 1 and 2, for example, as you create your final project. So I will go over the rubric with you, like I said, excuse me, hopefully by Friday, and then try to share with you what we'll be looking for. I know some of this can seem rather confusing, but I think the textbook does a pretty good job in terms of describing the process that has to take place, the judicial process that has to take place for trials and so forth. So it's going to require you to do some reading and using some outside resources as you begin to finalize your paper and try to put all of this together. Okay, I know that we're not lawyers, so all I'm looking for really is that you have a basic concept of what the process is or what the key terms and concepts are associated with each step of the rubric, and then your ability to provide additional research and or specific examples to illustrate to me that you have a really good understanding of the process. Okay, so that I understand. So hang in there with me. We're almost through, and I think we're going to do just fine. Okay, so let me go over what we're doing in Module 6 this week. We have a discussion board assignment. Discussion board assignment requires you to access and use LexisNexis, which is accessible via the Superior Library portal in Blackboard. So make sure that you take time to research your case. We're looking for criminal cases. But what I've done in the announcement section is I posted how to go about accessing that through the Shapiro portal, the Shapiro Library portal. So I've provided you with information on how to access LexisNexis, and then what you should search for to look for cases, criminal cases involving the issue of change of venue. Okay. I've also provided you an example in our discussion board. I posted something today, and it's just an example of basically what we're looking for this assignment. Okay, it's nothing too detailed, and you can take a look at it. It's pretty simple, straightforward, but obviously you're going to have to research the case and then provide the substance to your case that meets the assignment criteria. All right, so take a look at that. If you have any questions on that, then by all means, please don't hesitate to get a hold of me. So this week we have the discussion board, but we also are going to write a short paper dealing with mandatory minimum sentencing and sentencing guidelines. And so I just want to take a few minutes to go over this because these are going to be concepts that you're going to have to address in your final project. And so understanding what they are and how they fit into the scheme of things here will benefit you a little bit as you begin to, again, work on your final project and start getting that ready to be submitted. I will also, like I said, work on a presentation for you where we go over each of these requirements. Some of them you've already had before. Any of the new ones I'll go into a little bit more detail, but hopefully to give you some insight as to what we're looking for. Okay, so I think it'll go smooth. Just bear with me. You're doing fine, all of you. So just hang in there. It's not as complicated as it may seem. Okay. So let's just talk about what we're doing this week. So what is due this week? Again, a discussion on change of venue, and then the short paper mandatory minimum sentences and judicial efficiency. So this is what to do this week. So again, I've outlined the instructions for accessing LexisNexis in announcement section today. And then we'll talk a little bit about mandatory minimum sentences and judicial efficiency and what it all means. So what is mandatory minimum? So mandatory minimum sentencing laws require binding prison terms for a particular length for people convicted of certain federal and state crimes. Okay, these are generally not very flexible. It is sort of the one size fits all. And this has really been often defined as a rather quick fix solution for crime. Much of this came about during the 1980s when we began to see a spike in crime, and it was often associated with crack cocaine. So we had a crack cocaine epidemic, an increase in violent crime associated with that. And so not only did the federal government, but state governments also began looking at mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines, and did so in part because some legislators thought that judges were getting soft on crime and criminals. And so the mandatory minimum sentencing laws were developed. Some people believe that mandatory minimum sentencing laws undermine justice by preventing judges from fitting the punishment to the individual and the circumstances of their offenses. This is sometimes evident in drug cases, especially at the federal level, where if an individual, for example, sells so much of a quantity of a drug, let's say marijuana, then that'll trigger the mandatory minimum. And so you have cases where people were engaged in just selling a marijuana, but it passed that threshold of mandatory minimums. And the judges, even though they might have wanted to reduce the sentence because of the circumstances, were unable to do so because of mandatory minimum sentencing laws. So these laws caused not only federal prison populations to soar, but also state prison populations began to soar. And the reason for this is because mandatory minimums. If you were convicted of a certain crime, you had to go to state prison typically, or federal prison as part of your punishment with a mandatory minimum, which was often 5 years. And so that caused an increase in our prison populations. That led to overcrowding, huge costs to the taxpayers, and all kinds of social issues arose out of that. Now, what we're beginning to see now is that many states and the federal government as well are beginning to loosen these mandatory minimum laws because they realize what's happened. The other question that you have to look at this week in your paper is whether or not they lead to some level of judicial efficiency. And then that's something obviously for you to decide for yourself. But one of the consequences obviously was impacted prison populations. And so many states are now beginning to reconsider these type of laws, especially for drug offenses. And most mandatory minimum sentences apply to drug offenses at the federal level. And at the federal level, but Congress has enacted them for other crimes, including certain gun crimes, for example, pornography, economic offenses, in which someone might, for example, milk clients out of millions or billions of dollars in some type of Ponzi scheme or something to that effect. And so we're beginning to see mandatory minimums applied not just for violent crime, but for what we would term nonviolent offenses. All right. So mandatory minimum sentences, again, what is it? That's what it is. How's it applied? I sort of gave you a thumbnail sketch as to how's it applied. At the end of my presentation, I have a link for the federal government, so you could take a look at their sentencing guidelines. But you might also want to just take a quick look at what your state's doing. All right, and so this will help out because as part of your final project, or even for this paper, you know, you need to supply some type of specific information or details that goes beyond just what's being asked here. And then I'll discuss that here in just a little bit. But that's basically what mandatory minimum is. Next is what are sentencing guidelines. And for example, at the federal level, the federal sentencing guidelines are non-binding rules that set out a uniform sentencing policy for defendants convicted in the United States federal court system, and that became effective in 1987. So how does this work? I mean, how does the judge, for example, figure out the length of a sentence on a specific individual? And under the federal system, the judges have sentencing guidelines, and sentencing guidelines are sort of like a rubric in some respects. On the left-hand column, you might have certain characteristics, and on the right-hand side, you'll have months of punishment. And basically, you sort of go down one column, go across on the other, and then that gives the judge a range of months in which an appropriate sentence would lie. And then it's up to the judge to determine that appropriate sentence from using that sort of rubric or a guideline. Okay, it is in fact, it's like a math formula. And that math formula calculates a prison term based on a couple different factors. For example, the seriousness of the offense, the defendant's criminal history, in other words, is he a repeat offender, aggravating and mitigating circumstances, what was the person's role in a particular offense. So in our little scenario, we're dealing with 3 individuals, and if one were the getaway driver, is that going to be calculated in as part of the sentencing guidelines because they didn't have an active role in the actual robbery versus the other 2 who went in with the weapons. So those are some of the aggravating and mitigating factors that come into play. Now, some states follow the federal guidelines, and some states have their own version. So if you're dealing with a criminal matter in a state court, you can go ahead and take a look at what your state has. Does it have any specific sentencing guidelines that might apply? And each state often does. They have what we call enhancements, which adds time on to an individual sentence. For example, if you committed a crime in the furtherance of a criminal street gang, then there's an enhancement. You serve more time. The old saying, use a gun, go to prison. Again, more time. So these are criteria that states and federal government look at in terms of trying to determine the appropriate sentence for an individual who violates the law. Okay, so again, oftentimes we're looking at the seriousness of the offense, the defendant's criminal history, aggravating, mitigating circumstances, and again, it's like a math formula that calculates a prison term based on, again, a series of factors. In addition, like I talked to you before, sentencing guidelines take some discretion away from the courts. And some people believed, especially in the 1980s when we began to see this increase in crime, that some judges were too soft on crime, that it became a problem. Okay, and so this was the means to correct that. So that's what sentencing guidelines is about. Here's a link for the federal sentencing guidelines. So take a look. It gives you some ideas. You might be able to do some of it for your paper as an example, as a specific reference. You could probably take a look at bank robbery, see what they say about bank robbery as a means to enhance your paper using specific details and examples. Okay. Lastly, this week, the assignment guidelines for this paper are that the definition, so you need to define mandatory minimum sentences and sentencing guidelines. So do some research and define those, okay? If it requires that you're examining state and federal, then by all means make sure you do proper research. The purpose, again, referencing your textbook or resource materials, explain why we have mandatory minimums, what's their purpose, what purpose do they serve, and include specific and relevant examples so you can use your textbook and the resource materials that are offered this week. And then you need to state your opinion as to whether mandatory minimum sentences help or hinder judicial efficiency, and explain your position by explaining why and how they do so. So again, include specific and relevant examples based on your research. So use your resources that you have. You can do some other research online and see if you can't come up with some specific and relevant examples, something to enhance your position, your paper on this particular area of the requirements, okay? All right, I hope that helps. Anything else, please let me know, but I will get out that other one for our final paper here hopefully this week. Thank you.